Welcome to the Empire Review, the series that gives you a front row seat at the courtrooms shaping New York. I'm Jonathan Arias. The year has started off strong, to say the least, with the last 2 weeks feeling like 6 months. Every day, there seems to be a new fire, another emergency. In this segment, I explain a federal court's injunction of President Trump's attempt to freeze federal spending. On January 27th, the Office of Management and Budget, short for OMB, issued a memo directing all federal agencies to examine all federal financial assistance programs to identify which ones may be affected by all of the president's executive orders. Notably, the memo said that federal agencies, quote, must temporarily pause all activities related to dispersing financial assistance, and that it must stop funding for organizations involved in foreign aid, DEI, woke gender ideology, and the Green New Deal. The next day, a group of nonprofit organizations sued the OMB in federal court and asked for what's known as a temporary restraining order. Roughly speaking, a temporary restraining order stops a defendant from doing something. In this case, a restraining order will tell the OMB, hey, cut your shit and cut those checks. Now, when a judge decides whether to issue this type of order, she considers whether a plaintiff is likely to win her case after both sides have fully argued their points. This sort of hearing is like a movie trailer. It only gives a preview of what's to come, but it gives the judge just enough information to decide if the defendant should be stopped. In addition, the judge also considers whether not issuing this order would cause the plaintiffs what's known as irreparable harm. Irreparable harm is a type of injury that can't be fixed with monetary compensation. Now, for this question, the judge is asking, if I don't issue this order, will plaintiffs ever recover from the harm that they'll experience? Here's one more piece of important background information. On January 29th, the day after the organizations sued the OMB issued a new memo indicating that the previous memo, the one that started the freeze, had been rescinded. Shortly after the so-called rescission, the White House press secretary posted on Twitter that the new memo was, quote, not a rescission of the federal funding freeze, and that it was simply a rescission of the OMB memo. She then finished the post by saying that the purpose of the rescission was to end any confusion by the court's injunction, and importantly, that the president's funding freeze was in full force. The significance of this will be clear soon. When someone brings an action in federal court, or any court for that matter, they have to first demonstrate that the court has jurisdiction, or the power to hear the case. By law, courts will only entertain live controversies. Now, the Constitution created this limit so that judges and lawyers don't waste their time with disputes that have no practical importance. Courts will not consider something moot. That's spelled M-O-O-T. When the OMB rescinded the freezing memo following the lawsuit, it basically attempted to moot the case out of court. In other words, they tried to strip the court of its authority to resolve the dispute. But this didn't work in their favor because after the rescission, you'll recall that the White House press secretary tweeted that the funding freeze was still in full force. Simply put, the rescission was a mere formality with absolutely no substance. The White House clearly maintained that the plan to freeze funding was in full force. The court, therefore, had its jurisdiction. Now, I'll explain what I think is the most important part of this decision: whether the Constitution gives the president the power to freeze spending in this manner. In sum, the judge found that this freeze likely violates the Appropriations Clause of the Constitution, which says, no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law. In plain English, this clause grants Congress exclusive power over federal spending. Congress has the power of the purse. When a president attempts to block congressionally approved funding, this is called impoundment. Now, throughout history, presidents dating back to Thomas Jefferson have attempted to halt spending in some fashion. But the most notable incident occurred when Richard Nixon withheld federal funds for water pollution treatment programs, funds that were appropriated by Congress under the Federal Water Pollution Control Act. Now, it's important to know that presidents can actually withhold funding, but they must follow a specific procedure. That procedure is outlined in the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974. Under this law, the president can temporarily defer payments or actually rescind them, but only with Congress's approval. Now here, the president didn't follow that procedure or even pretend to. He issued the executive orders and told the OMB to freeze all payments. So, having not followed this procedure, the judge previewed that the president likely violated the appropriations clause. Looking forward, it's likely that the president will challenge this all the way up to the Supreme Court. And once there, he'll ask them to invalidate the Impoundment Control Act as unconstitutional. In the Constitution, there's a section that says the president must take care that the laws be faithfully executed. So the argument will be something along the lines of, I'm the president and we're spending too much money wastefully. The Impoundment Act is therefore unconstitutional. The judge also found that this freeze was arbitrary and impulsive, violating the Administrative Procedure Act. Under this law, a court must invalidate an agency's action if it is arbitrary, capricious, an abuse of discretion, or otherwise not in accordance with law. In other words, the law requires that there be a rational connection between the facts, the agency's rationale, and the ultimate decision. Here, the judge found that the OMB failed to explain why it needed to freeze all funding, not just some, all funding with less than 24 hours notice. Now, in defending its position, the OMB argued that there was nothing irrational about a temporary pause to ensure that agencies comply with the president's priorities. They also argued that payments made directly to individuals were not frozen. But the judge didn't buy this argument because she saw it as the OMB writing a sort of blank check for itself from the president to do what it wanted without following any procedure. In a way, the judge is basically saying that the administration was careless. Here's what she wrote. Rather than taking a measured approach to identify purportedly wasteful spending, the administration cut the fuel supply to a vast, complicated, nationwide machine, seemingly without any consideration for the consequences of that decision. Now, leading up to this decision, the consequences have already been felt. One organization in the lawsuit declared that it was forced to lay off 2 employees the day after the memo because it couldn't access its grant funds that day. A healthcare center declared that it couldn't afford to delay payments to its employees because some of them live paycheck to paycheck, like most people in this country. And several other organizations declared that they've had to cut their expenses drastically. When the president was elected, people feared that our so-called democracy, if we even have one, would collapse. They feared that he would do whatever he wanted, completely ignoring the Constitution and even breaking it. Since he was very clear about what he would do, and yet millions of people voted him in, it's fair to say that people are entirely okay with this. Right now, the only thing holding him back is the courts, that part of the Constitution that remains. But who knows how long that'll last. I want to finish off by reading a line from a book that helps me see what's happening. The book is by Francis Fukuyama and it's called The End of History and the Last Man. All regimes capable of effective action must be based on some principle of legitimacy. There is no such thing as a dictator who rules purely by force, as is commonly said, for instance, of Hitler. A tyrant can rule his children, old men, or perhaps his wife by force, if he is physically stronger than them. But he is not likely to be able to rule more than 2 or 3 people in this fashion, and certainly not a nation of millions. Now, when we say that a dictator like Hitler ruled by force, what we mean is that Hitler's supporters, including the Nazi Party and the Gestapo, were able to physically intimidate the larger population. But what made these supporters loyal to Hitler? Well, certainly not his ability to intimidate them physically. Ultimately, it rested upon their belief in his legitimate authority. Security apparatuses can themselves be controlled by intimidation, but at some point in the system, the dictator must have loyal subordinates who believe in his legitimate authority. As Socrates explains in Plato's Republic, even among a band of robbers, there must be some principle of justice that permits them to divide their spoils. Legitimacy is thus crucial to even the most unjust and bloody dictatorship.